Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are stepping into a quieter, dimmer corner of history, one where ordinary objects seem to carry something far heavier than their shape or weight. These are the things that people whisper about rather than explain. The items that appear harmless, yet leave behind stories of misfortune, fear, and mystery. Whether these tales are truth, exaggeration, or simply our minds trying to find meaning in chaos, they have followed us across generations. For as long as people have created and owned objects, there has been the belief that certain items can absorb emotions, especially strong ones. Grief, anger, jealousy, love, or regret. In many cultures, it is thought that when a moment is intense enough, something of it remains behind. Sometimes in a place, sometimes in a person, and sometimes in an object. The idea of cursed objects begins here, the belief that negative experiences or unresolved conflicts can cling to material things and continue to influence those who encounter them. It may sound supernatural, but on a psychological level, it makes sense why people feel this way. Objects are the witnesses to our lives. They stay after we leave. They remain when people change. A wedding ring outlives a marriage. A child's toy remains when the child grows up. A chair can sit silently in a room long after its owner is gone. So when an object becomes tied to tragedy, loss, or violence, it is easy to understand why some feel uneasy around it. But these stories do not survive simply because of fear. They endure because they speak to something deeply human. The sense that emotion has weight, that memory can echo, that the world around us may hold more than what we see. When we talk about cursed objects like a doll locked in a glass case or a wooden chair no one dares to sit in, we are not only telling ghost stories, we are exploring the idea that the past is never fully gone. It lingers, quietly, waiting to be noticed. And with that thought in mind, let us begin our journey into some of the most famous cursed objects ever recorded. The first object we will look at is perhaps one of the most widely recognized in modern times, the Annabelle doll. Her story began not in a museum or an abandoned house, but in a small, ordinary apartment in the 1970 seconds. At first glance, Annabelle looked gentle, almost comforting, made of fabric, with soft features and a simple smile. There was nothing about her appearance that suggested fear or mystery, and maybe that contrast is what made her story spread so widely later on. Annabelle came into the life of a young woman as a thoughtful gift. The kind meant to decorate a room or offer a touch of warmth. But soon after, unusual things began to happen, small at first. The doll seemed to shift positions when no one was watching. A hand that had been placed neatly by its side would be resting differently the next morning. Doors that had been closed were found slightly open. And then there were the notes, short messages written on scraps of paper, as if someone or something wanted to be acknowledged. A word of these experiences reached two people who had become known for documenting and studying unexplained events, Ed and Lorraine Warren. They listened, they observed, and they believed that the doll was not simply a toy, but something that had become a point of focus for attention, emotional, psychological, or possibly something beyond. The Warrens eventually took Annabelle into their care, placing her behind glass, sealed and protected, not to hide her from the world, but to separate the world from her. What is important here is not just the events themselves, but why the story continues to be told. People became fascinated because Annabelle did not look threatening. She was ordinary, familiar. A reminder that not every mystery arrives dressed in shadows. Sometimes it sits quietly in a well-lit room, waiting to be noticed. Annabelle's story became a legend because it speaks to something universal, the idea that the everyday can hold the extraordinary. That something soft and harmless can carry a presence we cannot name. Whether one believes these events happened exactly as told is not the point. The lasting effect is the feeling. The story leaves behind a question that lingers even after the lights are off. As the years went on, the story of Annabelle did not fade. It expanded. What began as a quiet account shared among a few people slowly became part of a much larger conversation about the unknown. Visitors who saw the doll, in her case, spoke not just of curiosity, but of unease, as if simply being near her stirred something uncertain. Over time, stories emerged of those who treated the doll lightly, laughed at her history, or challenged the warnings placed beside her. Some of these individuals later reported experiencing unexpected accidents or misfortunes, creating the impression that Annabelle was not just a passive object, but an active presence. This is where the legend took shape, not from dramatic events, but from the way people responded to her. Annabelle became a symbol of caution, the idea that something can appear harmless while carrying a deeper weight. It is the same reason old stories about mirrors, portraits, or heirlooms continue to be told. The ordinary becomes unsettling, not through appearance, but through the stories that wrap around it. As these accounts continued to circulate, the public imagination filled in the empty spaces. Films, documentaries, and books helped spread the story even further. Yet, when you strip away the dramatization, what remains is very simple. A belief that objects can hold on to the emotional energy of the past. Annabelle's story endures not because of how she looks, but because of what she suggests, that the boundary between the physical world and the unseen is thinner than we assume. There is also something deeply human in the way her story resonates. People have always searched for ways to explain the unexplainable. When something strange happens, an unexpected sound, a feeling of being watched, a moment when the air in the room seems different, we instinctively look for patterns. Objects are the most silent witnesses to our lives. They sit beside us, day after day, absorbing what we go through. For some, this feels comforting. For others, unsettling. Annabelle represents that uncertainty. She reminds us that stories do not need to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes the whisper is enough. And with that quiet understanding, we move forward to another object with a different history, yet the same lingering sense of weight, the so-called death chair. And before we move to the next object, it is helpful to understand why stories like Annabelle resonate so strongly. Dolls are meant to be symbols of innocence, soft, harmless, and familiar. Many of us grew up with them. They watched over our rooms, sat on shelves, or traveled with us during childhood. They are shaped like us, but not alive. And that is where the quiet tension begins. When something resembles a human form, our minds naturally expect signs of life, movement, expression, warmth, but dolls do not offer any of these. They have the appearance of emotion without actually feeling, the outline of a person without the presence. This creates a subtle discomfort known as the uncanny valley, a psychological response where something looks human enough to be familiar, yet not human enough to be comforting. It is similar to hearing a voice in an empty room, or seeing a shadow in a place that should be still. The mind leans forward, searching for meaning, unsure of what it is perceiving. Stories of haunted dolls draw upon this space between recognition and doubt. They ask a quiet question. What if something that watches also remembers? In many cultures, it has long been believed that objects can absorb emotional traces from their surroundings. A doll that sits in a room for years may feel to the imagination like it has witnessed more than it should. This alone is enough to stir unease. But the fear is not really about the doll. It is about the familiar turning unfamiliar, the safe turning uncertain. When something ordinary shifts, even slightly, it reminds us that control is fragile, that our understanding of the world is built on trust that the chair will stay where it is, the door will stay closed, the doll will remain still. When that trust is shaken, even by a small story, the mind begins to wander. This is why haunted doll stories last. They touch something deep and quiet inside us, the part that wonders what exists just outside the edges of explanation. They do not rely on dramatic displays. They linger, softly, patiently. And now, with that undercurrent in mind, we move on to one of the most unsettling tales, connected not to a figure of innocence, but to a simple, everyday object, a wooden chair that earned a reputation no one expected. Our next object does not carry the gentle shape of a doll. It is not something associated with childhood or comfort. It is something far more ordinary, a chair, a wooden, everyday chair that once sat in a small inn in England. It was known as Busby's stoop chair, though most people eventually began calling it something else. The death chair. The story traces back to a man named Thomas Busby, who lived during the early 1700s. Accounts differ on the exact details, but the core of the story remains consistent. Busby was involved in a violent conflict. Before facing his punishment, he sat in his favorite chair for the last time, According to local legend, he cursed the chair, saying that anyone who sat in it afterward would meet misfortune. Whether he said those words out of anger, pride, or despair is unknown. But what followed is what turned an ordinary piece of furniture into something much larger. Over the years, people began to notice a pattern. Visitors who sat in the chair did not simply face bad luck, they faced severe, sometimes fatal, consequences shortly afterward. Soldiers who rested in the chair before going to war did not return. Workers who sat in it during their lunch breaks suffered sudden accidents soon after. Each story added another layer, another whisper, another reason for someone to say, "Maybe do not sit there." What gave the legend weight was not just repetition, it was the way the stories traveled. They were told, quietly, passed from one person to another, until the chair was no longer seen as just furniture. It became a symbol, a warning, something that invited curiosity at the same time it pushed people away. Eventually, the chair was placed in a museum, not displayed in the center, not celebrated, but hung high on a wall where no one could sit in it again. Not to honor it, but to prevent the possibility of one more name being added to its story. What stands out about the death chair is not something dramatic or supernatural. It is how simple it is. A chair is one of the most ordinary objects we encounter in daily life. We sit without thinking. We trust the space we occupy. So when something as basic as a place to rest becomes linked with misfortune, it challenges a quiet belief we all share that the everyday world is safe, predictable, and familiar. The death chair reminds us how quickly that comfort can shift, how a story can change the way we look at something we once ignored, and how the line between coincidence and meaning is sometimes thinner than we want to admit. The story of the death chair raises a larger idea, one that appears in cultures all around the world. It is the belief that objects can hold on to the emotions or intentions of the people who use them. It may seem unusual at first, but it is not so different from how people treasure a loved one's belongings, or how a room can feel different after a difficult argument. Spaces and objects can carry memory, or at least feel as though they do. In the case of the chair, the key is not only the supposed curse, it is the moment connected to it. A final statement before punishment. A surge of anger, fear, or defiance. When emotions are strong, we remember the room, the temperature, the smallest details. It is easy to imagine that objects in that moment might somehow remember too. Whether this is something metaphysical or simply psychological, the effect is the same. People avoid the chair because of the story that surrounds it, not because of the wood itself. When people heard about soldiers who did not return, or workers who had accidents after sitting in the chair, they were not just reacting to tragedy, they were fitting events into a narrative that already existed. Once the idea takes root that an object is dangerous, every misfortune around it begins to look like evidence. This is how legends grow, not from definitive proof, but from the way our minds connect dots. We fill gaps and try to make sense of outcomes that feel too heavy to be random. But beneath the legend, the death chair reflects something deeply human. It shows how we assign meaning to the objects in our lives. A wedding ring symbolizes commitment. A photograph holds a moment in time. A gift can carry the warmth of the person who gave it. If those objects can hold positive meaning, it feels natural, even if unsettling, to imagine that an object could also hold something darker. This belief does not require ghosts or spirits. It requires memory, emotion, the sense that the past can stay close even when we think we have left it behind. And whether someone believes the chair is cursed or not, they often react the same way. They hesitate before sitting, they feel the story before they reason through it. The death chair reminds us that meaning is not only built from facts, it is built from what we feel when we are in the presence of something that carries a story. And sometimes that story is enough. As these stories circulated about dolls, chairs, mirrors, paintings, and other ordinary items, another question began to rise. What should be done with them? Some people believed they should be destroyed, broken, burned, buried, or thrown away. Yet, in many cases, these objects were not destroyed. Instead, they were placed in museums or private collections, sealed behind glass or stored in rooms that are rarely opened. And the reasoning behind this speaks to something more complex than fear. Museums that house these objects are not displaying them as attractions to celebrate or admire. They are acknowledging the stories attached to them. When an object becomes the center of repeated accounts of misfortune or unease, it gains a kind of cultural weight. People approach it not out of thrill-seeking alone, but out of curiosity. Curiosity about the invisible connections between memory, emotion, and the physical world. A cursed object becomes a conversation piece, not just about the supernatural, but about psychology, history, and belief. For some, placing a cursed item in a museum is an act of containment. It is a way of saying, this story is powerful. We will give it space, but we will also create distance. The glass between the viewer and the object is more than physical. It is symbolic. A boundary. A respectful acknowledgement of something we may not fully understand. Collectors who keep such items often do so with strict rules. The object is not to be handled casually, not placed in crowded rooms, not passed around playfully. These precautions may seem dramatic, but they reflect the idea that meaning itself can be influential. Whether or not the object holds any actual harmful force, the story it carries affects those who interact with it. And there is another reason these objects are preserved. They remind us that the world is still full of mystery. In a time when much of life is documented, analyzed, measured, and explained, the existence of something that does not fit neatly into logic holds a certain allure. It gives people room to wonder, to question, to imagine. So the museums keep their glass cases. The collections keep their climate-controlled rooms, not because the objects must be feared, but because the stories inside them continue to matter. They allow us to explore the unknown safely through observation, distance, and awareness. They are reminders that not everything can be fully understood, and that some things are meant to be approached slowly, quietly, with a certain respect. Stories about cursed objects are not new. They have appeared in folklore, legends, and oral storytelling for centuries, long before museums, books, or films. In many cultures, objects are seen as extensions of the human experiences surrounding them. A sword used in battle, a mirror kept in a grieving household, a piece of jewelry passed from one generation to another. These things are not just objects. They become carriers of memory, emotion, and identity. And when a moment of strong feeling enters the story, especially one marked by loss or conflict, the object may begin to feel like it holds a presence of its own. This belief appears around the world. In Japan, there are tales of tsukumogami, ordinary tools that come to life after 100 years, shaped by the way they were treated. In parts of Europe, there are stories of mourning jewelry made from the hair of a loved one, believed to hold both love and sorrow in equal measure. As in West African traditions, personal items are sometimes handled carefully because they are thought to carry a part of the owner's spirit. These stories are not identical, but their message is remarkably similar. Objects do not exist apart from us. They travel alongside us, quietly absorbing the traces we leave behind. When these ideas enter popular culture, they become even more powerful. Films, novels, documentaries, and online discussions create shared images that millions of people recognize. A haunted doll locked in a glass case. A mirror that should never be looked into alone. A painting that seems to watch the room it sits in. These stories grow not just because they frighten, but because they feel familiar. They tap into the part of the human mind that wonders what lies just beyond understanding. And popular culture does more than repeat the stories, it gives them a stage. Once a cursed object enters public imagination, it becomes a symbol. It represents the unknown. It asks a question we cannot easily answer. How much of the world is shaped by what we feel rather than what we see? This is why cursed object stories continue to survive, even when explained, doubted, or dismissed. They are not only tales of mystery, they are reflections of the human sense that the past is never completely gone. It lingers in rooms, in memories, and in the quiet weight of the objects we leave behind. Not everyone believes that objects can hold energy or influence events. Many people view these stories through a different lens, one rooted in psychology rather than the supernatural. From this perspective, the power of a cursed object does not come from the object itself, but from the beliefs, emotions, and expectations that surround it. When a story is strong enough, the mind often fills in details on its own. This idea is closely connected to something known as suggestion. When people hear that an object is cursed, they may become more attentive to any strange feeling, accident, or hesitation that follow. A small misstep, A minor headache? A forgotten key. Things that happen every day suddenly feel meaningful. The mind is always searching for patterns, especially in situations that feel uncertain or emotionally charged. And when a story is already present, the mind fits new experiences into the shape of that story. There is also the factor of coincidence. Life is full of unpredictable events. Good days. Bad days. Sudden turns of luck. When something difficult happens after someone interacts with a well-known object, the timing alone can be enough to make the story grow. Even if the event has no direct connection to the object at all, the human mind is often more comfortable with a pattern, even a frightening one, than with randomness. Another explanation comes from emotional association. If an object is linked to a moment of strong feeling, grief, anger, fear, then simply being near it can bring those emotions to the surface again. The discomfort feels real because it is real, even if it comes from memory rather than anything physical. In that way, the curse may be less about the object and more about the weight of the story attached to it. For skeptics, these explanations reinforce the belief that cursed objects reveal more about us than about the objects themselves. They show how meaning is created, how fear spreads, and how the human mind works to connect events into a coherent narrative. From this point of view, the power of a cursed object is not something supernatural, it is the power of belief. And yet, even skeptics acknowledge something important: the stories persist. They travel. They adapt. They continue to be told. Which means that cursed objects, whether truly touched by something unseen or shaped entirely by human imagination, remain part of how we make sense of the world. Cursed object. Stories endure because they live in the space between what can be explained and what can only be felt. Even in a world shaped by science, technology, and constant information, there are experiences that sit just outside the reach of logic. A room that suddenly feels heavy. An object that draws attention for reasons we cannot name. A memory that lingers in the air long after the moment has passed. These are small things, quiet things, but they stay with us. The idea that an object can hold on to the past is not only a supernatural concept, it is a human one. We keep items from loved ones who have passed away. We store letters, photographs, clothing, jewelry, toys. We give objects meaning because meaning helps us remember. It helps us feel connected to something larger than ourselves. So, if an object can hold warmth, affection, and memory, it is not difficult to imagine that it could also hold something heavier, something unresolved. Cursed object stories allow us to explore this idea safely. They create a distance, an object behind glass, a chair no one touches, a doll locked away. We can look without being involved. We can wonder without needing to decide, and that is part of the draw. These stories do not demand belief. They simply invite it. They also remind us that the world is layered. There is the surface, the day-to-day routine, the familiar surroundings, the predictable pattern. And then there is what lies underneath the memories, emotions, histories, and quiet echoes that shape the way we move through life. When a story suggests that an object carries something unseen, it is really pointing to the idea that life itself carries more than we can easily measure. Whether one believes in curses or sees them as reflections of the mind, the effect is the same. These stories stay. They move through time. They change shape. They find new listeners. Not because they prove something supernatural, but because they remind us that mystery is still possible, that there are corners of our experience we do not fully understand. And maybe part of us likes it that way. So when we talk about cursed objects, we are really talking about ourselves, our fears, our memories, our need for meaning, our curiosity about what might exist beyond explanation. These stories endure because they speak softly to a truth we all recognize. Not everything is visible, not everything is simple, and not everything is finished. So, as we look back at these stories, the doll sealed behind glass, the chair hung high so no one can sit in it, and all the objects that quietly sit between memory and myth, we find that the truth is not only in what may or may not be supernatural. The real truth is in how these stories make us feel. They remind us that the past is not something that disappears. It lingers. In rooms. In objects. In the quiet pauses between moments we do not know how to explain. whether these items are truly touched by something unseen, or whether the meaning comes from the stories we wrap around them. They hold a place in our imagination. They allow us to explore the unknown without needing to solve it. They offer a space where doubt and belief can sit side by side, and sometimes that space is all we need. Thank you for spending this time here in the calm and quiet part of the story. If this journey stirred something, a thought, a memory, a small question, just let it rest for now. No need to answer it. I will see you again soon in the next story. Good night.